Hi, I'm Zachary Cowan, the author of the Study Daily Books, and thanks for joining me for a look at Abraham chapters 1 and 2. Right at the beginning of Abraham, there's this italicized declaration that says that the book of Abraham is a translation of some accounts of Abraham that have fallen into our hands on these scrolls of papyrus written by the hand of Abraham himself. And because of that phrase, there's been a lot of people that have struggled with their belief because of things about the history of the book of Abraham coming for us. So we're just going to cover that really quickly. In 1885, Joseph Smith purchases some mummies and some papyri. And so they gather together some money collectively as a church, and then they buy them. In the coming 7 months, he translates 5 chapters of the book of Abraham. Now, it's not always clear exactly how he did this, whether it was from, did he use a seer stone and look at it? Was he getting revelation and inspiration like he was by looking at the text and then getting clarifications like he did with the book of Moses? Was it a Book of Mormon thing where it's covered? And we don't know. We don't know all the details of how he translates this, but he translates it. But it's not really published for the members of the church until 1842, about 7 years later, when they're in Nauvoo, and it's part of the times and seasons. Later, after Joseph's death, Emma continued to use the mummies and the scrolls as part of a way to bring income in. As people would stop by the house, they would pay money to see the mummies and the scrolls. Then in 1856, she sold them to Abel Coombs, who then sold them to the Wood Museum in Chicago. And in 1871, the Great Chicago Fire burned up the museum, and we thought it burned up all of the mummies and the papyri until 1966, where a fragment, like facsimile number 1, that picture of Abraham being on the altar, was discovered. And so you had recovered some portions of the Joseph Smith papyri, about 5 feet worth of the Joseph Smith papyri. Now, Joseph, in his accounts, indicates that we had 60 to 80 feet worth of rolls and papyri. We don't have all of that. We just have a small portion of it. And 2 discoveries were made that have caused people to really have doubts about the book of Abraham. The first one being that nothing other than the facsimile, number 1, the picture, it's the book of breathing, it's not the book of Abraham, as Egyptologists have looked at it. And number 2, the papyri themselves do not date to the time of Abraham. They're not 2,000 years before Jesus Christ. They date to about 100 BC to 100 AD. And so that line where it says, by the very hand of account of Abraham, remember, this could be a copy of Abraham's account. We don't have to throw everything out. But because of that, people have had some doubts and struggles with the book of Abraham because of these. And the church has been very upfront from the very beginning. They published an article in the New Era, or the Era magazine, right after that. And if you want to learn more about the book of Abraham and its historicity, the church even has a gospel topic essay to help you with this. And so you can go to your gospel library section, click on church history, hit on gospel topic essays, and then you can find historicity of the book of Abraham and the book of Abraham translation. Now, for me, I love the book of Abraham, and I have found it to be an inspiring book of scripture that reads like scripture and motivates me to live a better life. It starts with the profound things, the very first 4 verses start off with Abraham's great desires, and we know that our desires determine our destiny. So go ahead, pause your video, and check out Abraham chapter 1, verses 1 through 4, and you might want to look for and mark all of the goals and the desires of Abraham. Hey, thanks for studying. I'm sure you saw that Abraham wants to be I want greater knowledge. I want to be a person of righteousness and a prince of peace and a father of nations. There's not many people out there that's oh yeah, I want to be a dad or a mom. But to be the father of nations, that means you want the covenants that only God can offer. You want to become like he and heavenly parents. And so he seeks that. What are your desires? What are the righteous desires of your heart? And how are they governing what you're seeking and spending your time to do? Abraham's whole life is defined by his desires, and our lives will be defined by our desires as well. Well, the early childhood of Abraham, I like Abraham. He grows up, and he's the only active member of his family. His dad used to be a member of the church, but he's not anymore. In fact, he's fallen into the beliefs of Egyptology, and they're living there in the Babylon of the Chaldees, and he's even worshiping and making false idols. And Abraham is kind of a troublemaker because he refuses to pray to these idols. And so they're going to offer him up. And that's how this picture, these facsimiles come to be of a priest offering up Abraham. And Abraham wasn't even alone. We learn more about these sacrifices and even how Abraham escaped it. So go ahead, pause your video, check out Abraham chapter 1, verses 11 through 20, and you're going to look for how Abraham escaped and also learn about 3 righteous women who did not escape. Thanks for studying. You've seen now that Abraham cries out into the Lord and he is delivered, and the Lord hears his voice and even says, like, I heard your voice, and even knows his name, right? In verse 16, Abraham, Abraham, then in 18, Abraham. And yet at the same time Abraham is delivered, these 3 righteous young women were not delivered. There are sometimes that deliverance comes speedily and helpfully, and there are other times that deliverance doesn't come, and that our prayers kind of go unanswered, and sacrifices are made, and people die. And navigating that is an act of faith, both having faith that deliverance one day will come with the resurrection as we overcome death or cancer that does win in this life or appear to win in this life, versus the immediate miraculous deliverance that Abraham experienced. But the promise is the same in verse 18, that God says, I'll put my hand, I'll lead you, I'll put my name on you, I'll give you my priesthood and the power of that to be able to overcome eventually and to come forth. Because of that, the priest is killed and the lion couch is broken and Abraham is delivered. And then in verses 21 through 28, you have this, it talks a little bit about the religion of Egypt, where they claimed to come from the loins of Ham through Egyptus, the daughter of Ham, Ham being the son of Noah, who lost the right to the priesthood. Therefore, what happens among the Egyptians is they set up this religious similarity where they seek to mimic the order of the patriarchs by having a pharaoh and having gods and other things. And as they're seeking to do this, and yet they have no right to the priesthood. Well, this is a great way to look at many religions. And we look at them and we say, okay, what about the religions of the world? Notice that the book of Abraham calls Pharaoh a righteous man. The people of other faiths are righteous people. They're good people, even though they may not have the right to the priesthood and all of the power and authority of God. They're doing the best they have with what they have, and they're going forward. And so this is a way to look at it with respect, and also to learn from them, to be admirers of them, and to still at the same course come back and say, we have more that we would like to offer as well. Well, following this and the destruction of this, Abraham's dad, a famine comes into the land, and because of it, he kind of repents and he calls upon the Lord. And so as a family, they move, and they move to Haran. And there in Haran, Abraham's brother dies. And Abraham's brother had 3 children, Lot and Milcah and Sarai. And they need to be taken care of. And so Lot and his wife move in with Abraham. His name's Abram in Genesis, will later be changed to Abraham. And also you have these girls, Milcah and Sarai, and they marry their dad's brothers. And people are like, whoa, that's a little weird. And it is a little weird, because now in the church, we have a lot of options. If you want to have an eternal marriage, there are lots of families that are active. There's 17 million people that are members of the church. There's lots of people to choose from. Back then, they kind of kept it in the family because there wasn't very many families that were active, especially where Abraham came from. And so he goes ahead and he gets married, and Lot is pretty righteous too. And then famine returns, and his father becomes, again, his faith is pretty fleeting when hard times come. And so when it comes back, Abraham's going to tell us more about this covenant. See, this covenant that God makes with Abraham, called the Abrahamic Covenant, God has always made it with righteous prophets. But Abraham was so good at wanting it that it became named after him. This is the same covenant with Adam and Eve, same covenant with Noah and his spouse, same covenant with Enoch. And so go ahead, pause your video, and we're going to go learn more about the Abrahamic Covenant in Abraham chapter 2, verses 6 through 11. Hey, thanks for studying. You see this incredible covenant here that we get, and it's helpful to remember it just with 4 P's. And I wish I would have told you this beforehand so you could have looked for it. But God promises Abraham a promised land, a place of property where they could go and they could obtain this. And for him, it's the land of Canaan. For us, it's Zion. It's the process that we can become a part of Zion and even inherit the celestial kingdom. The next one is people. This considers of eternal marriages and eternal families, that we can have posterity, but also we can have eternal marriages and families that can come about because of that. And so it's this right to have a covenant with people eternally. The third one then would be the promise of the priesthood and the ordinances that allow these things to happen. And then finally, you have a promise that if you have these three things, you promise God that you will roam the earth offering these things to others. That's the responsibility, the promise that those who are of a covenant of Abraham make, is that they will make those blessings available to all and have God in our life where he can bless us and help us. And that might be an easy way to look at the Abrahamic covenant. Well, after God issues this Abrahamic covenant, Abraham starts to travel. And just really briefly, if you look at Abraham's travel, all the way from verses 15 through, well, everywhere he moves down through 20, every time Abraham moves, there's no church there. So he builds an altar and he offers sacrifice again and again and again. Abraham is righteous wherever he lives. And anytime a major transition or move happens in his life, he continues to have sacrifice and covenant be at the center. When Abraham moves out of his parents' home, he still has sacrament. When Abraham moves to a new city, he and his wife still have sacrament. When they're on the road, they're looking for those places and opportunities to renew covenants and to acknowledge God and to worship. And as they get ready to head down, like famine continues, they get into the land of Canaan, God says, you got to keep moving. And God warns him and says, look, your wife is really pretty. When you go into Egypt, they're going to kill you for her. So say that she is your sister. You don't get this in the book of Genesis. It just looks like Abraham's making up this lie. But here in Abraham, we know that Abraham is following the counsel of God, and it actually protects them. And that's what God is seeking to do, is provide protection and direction in our lives. In what way is God protecting and directing you in your path as you have traveled through life and continue to make covenants with him? Hey, thanks for studying. I hope that you've learned some great things from Abraham, who was righteous in all circumstances and can be a hero if you're the only member of your family. All right, we'll see you next time.